We're back. We have a quorum. Senator Skinner and Assemblymember Bryan. When you can join us, that would be great. So we've had, I think, a very productive morning so far. We've learned a lot. I hope that some of people on this panel have been watching our previous panels. I'm going to give the admonition that I give to everybody, which is that if you've written something, we've read it, please keep your comments to 5 minutes maximum. Really, truly, I will cut you off because the best parts of our conversations is when we are able to popcorn around the screen and talk about the various issues that we've been discussing. So this panel is we're gonna switch topics to talk about trauma recovery centers, which I think we've all been impressed by. Our panelists are two people from the California Victim Compensation Board, Linda Glenhill, who's the executive officer, and Katie Cardenas, excuse me if I'm pronouncing names wrong, deputy executive officer of External Affairs and Compliance Division. Dr. Gina Castro Rodriguez, executive director of the National Alliance for Trauma Recovery Centers. Dr. Annette Decker, assistant professor of Department of Emergency Medicine at UCLA. And Dr. Brina Taria. Is it Tyra? How do I pronounce that? Tyra, excuse me, I'm sorry. Director of Social Medicine at the Olive View UCLA Medical Center. Ms. Glenhill, please begin.
Thank you so much for having me, and we will try to make this brief, but I do have a short PowerPoint just to go through really so you can see the map that's embedded in here. But first, the California Victim Compensation Board, our primary mission is to pay the bills for victims of violent crime that helps them rebuild their lives. We cover medical, dental, mental health, relocation, other expenses that crime victims have. That is the core bulk of what the California Victim Compensation Board does. We also provide compensation to those who have been erroneously convicted. We work with our community partners. For trauma recovery centers, the legislation that established trauma recovery centers directs CalVCB to administer these grants. They provide trauma-informed services to victims of all types of violent crimes, including those with complex needs that don't meet the criteria to receive CalVCB services. By law, the trauma recovery centers have to follow a model of care established by University of California at San Francisco, which includes a multidisciplinary team of a psychologist, psychiatrist, and a licensed clinical social worker. Victims receive multi-complex, holistic services at trauma recovery centers. On the next slide, you'll see the map of where the current 24 trauma recovery centers are in California. As you can see, they are mostly concentrated in the Bay Area and the Los Angeles region. There are regional pilot programs that have 5 we receive special funding to try to reach more rural and underserved areas of Northern and Central California. These 5 satellite offices often offer victim services where they may not be able to reach them. But as you can see from this map, there are still large parts of the state that do not have access to trauma recovery centers. The funding source for trauma recovery centers, the only guaranteed funding is $2 million from the restitution fund. The total amount that trauma recovery center grants receive varies every year. So we receive the $2 million from the restitution fund. Then there is a percentage of savings from the Safe Neighborhood and School Funds, otherwise known as Prop 47. That is determined every year by the Department of Finance, and we are told what it is, and we use it for the grants. All the general fund money was one-time dollars that were provided, and those go through the 2025-26 fiscal year. So these dollars are all that exists for the trauma recovery centers, and so this is how CalVCB administers the grant program. So the state law requires us to administer the grant through a well-defined grant application process. We initiate that process with a notice of funds available, usually in December. This NOFA, as we call it, includes the comprehensive information, including application requirements, submission, review procedures, budget requirements, everything that's required for the grant application. Those are scored by TARBCB. Award recommendations are made based on the scores, which is really how what the applicant's ability is to meet the criteria outlined in state law. This recommendation is made then to our board that must approve the grants. And then those are finalized after we receive the final budget numbers after the governor's May revision is put out. A grantee is not required to take the money if they don't feel like it's enough to do what they need to do. And also we tell every grantee, we should not be your sole source of funding. Because there's such a limit to the amount of funds that we have. We encourage all the grantees to look for other sources of funds. So just very briefly, I know that there are two ideas that have been talked about. One is to give a preference to established TRCs. Our concern with that is simply that it's not allowed in the current statute, and quite frankly, would not necessarily be fair and equitable to new TRCs that would like to start up in other parts of the state. We also understand there's some talk about moving the current cycle from 2 years to 3 years. We do believe that that would just limit the ability of the TRCs to function because they would have to spread the same dollars out over a further amount of time. I'm not going to go through this chart. We can go through it later if we want to get into the details of the 2 versus 3 year cycle further. And I'm happy to, of course, answer any questions you have. The process of administering the TRC program.
Thank you very much. Dr. Castro Rodriguez.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Gina Castro Rodriguez. I'm the Executive Director of the National Alliance of Trauma Recovery Centers. So we have 52 trauma recovery centers nationwide, 24 now as of July 1st. So that's a little bit updated from the information I sent in. And they are in 15 counties throughout California. The TRC model was developed in 2001 by Dr. Alicia Bosolari at the University of California, San Francisco. And the model is unique in that it uses assertive outreach, trauma-focused mental health treatment, direct assistance for survivors, things like housing and transportation, childcare, money for food and clothing, meeting basic needs before we actually begin working on the trauma, because we know that the trauma affects people very broadly. And we also have a very flexible service delivery model because we understand trauma. So we meet people in their homes, in the community, at other community-based organizations, wherever they feel comfortable. And we can also do virtual and in-person services. Our model serves victims of all violent crime, but we particularly serve victims of gun violence and homicides, which is unique. We also serve sexual assault survivors, human trafficking, domestic violence, other kinds of violence, but serving the gun violence and homicide survivors' family is really looking at trying to interrupt that cycle of violence. Dr. Bosolari developed the model, working with the Trauma One Center here in San Francisco at UCSF, when ER doctors would tell her, we can sew them up, but we can't make them well. So the medical treatment was very advanced, but nothing to follow up on all the social and emotional implications of the trauma. Only 1 in 10 victims in California access any services following being a victim of crime, and only 4% of those say that they got their needs met in any way to help them recover from trauma. So the TRC model is both intervention but prevention, because we're really trying to address that trauma and heal that trauma so that that person is not at risk for further victimization or for harming others in the future. And so we're working with really high level cases. The average number of traumatic incidences a person has before we see them is an average of 7. So we've got people that have really complex trauma with lots of victimization. The model is evidence-based. In 2007, we had a randomized treatment trial. We found we had really good outcomes that have been replicated at other TRCs. So we've improved accessing mental health care for sexual assault survivors from 6% to 71%, all other crime survivors from 38% to 72%. And we've increased access to victims' compensation from 23% to 72%. And then improvements in health. 74% show improvement in mental health, 51% show improvement in physical health, 52% show a decrease in alcohol use, 46% showed a decrease in PTSD symptoms or post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and 47% show a decrease in depression. So what we're doing is really working when we are able to work with people. So some of our challenges that CalVCB already spoke to, we only have the two funding sources, Prop 47 and then the restitution fund dollars.
Can you
And
tell me, sorry to interrupt. Typically don't like to interrupt, but I've had
Yes.
this question. Roughly what percentage is Prop 47 versus general fund?
a smaller percentage of Prop 47 because the amount changes every year. So I don't know
Right.
what the current calculation is for this year.
But is it 10% or 50%? I mean, what, 3%? Is it what?
I wouldn't know the accuracy of that. CalVCB would know that, but it's gradually getting smaller for us.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I was going to say in the most recent year, the restitution fund was 2 million and the Safe Neighborhood and Schools Fund was about 9 million. So that would be the ratio. And then the general fund dollars were 1.6, but that money expires next fiscal year.
Thank you. TRCs, they talked about diversifying funding. We're not eligible for violence intervention funding because we're seen as a treatment model and a mental health model. Very difficult to get mental health dollars in this category because a lot of those mental health dollars are directed towards severe mental illness, addiction, and homelessness, which are needed, but that leaves us out of those pots. There are no other dedicated funding for TRCs that we can apply for. So although it is encouraged for them to find diverse funding, it's very difficult for them to find other funding. Funding is distributed by CalVCB in two-year contracts. And one of the challenges with that is that every 2 years, at about 1.5 years, they don't know if they're going to decrease funding, if they're going to lose funding completely. And so it's very hard for them to keep people in those positions and keep the program running. This year, 7 of them came up for renewal, and there's an average of 46% cut to those TRCs, which is going to really drastically affect who they can serve. There's already layoffs in place. The communities are losing services. And 2 new TRCs were funded, which is great, but it's the same pot of money. So we just keep decreasing what people have and cutting the services instead of growing the services. So yes, we'll have another TRC, 2 more TRCs, but the existing ones are cutting their services in half, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Next year, another 17 of them will go up for, 15 of them will go up for funding. They will likely be decreased, and they'll also be competing with other new TRCs. So we don't have a strategic plan for this work. It's not in the penal code. We're in a legislative code. We're in the California government code, but we're actually not in the penal code right now. And we just are looking for sustainable funding for these services that we know work, that have proven efficacy, that reach the people most harmed by crime, but least avail access to care. And we really want to think about where this money lives so that it can be managed in a grant process rather than a contract process. And we can have some content experts that help advise the funding. And then also that we continue the technical assistance and training that we're doing. We've been doing it for about 1.5 years. Our contract expires September of 2025, and it won't exist anymore.
The budget stuff is for reasons that I said at the top, hard for us to get into, but I totally appreciate their mission critical. So, Dr. Decker.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having us this morning. My name is Annette Decker. I'm an emergency physician, health services researcher, and assistant professor at UCLA. My colleague, Brina Tyra, is also here on the committee. And I'm just going to briefly talk about the results of the study that we recently did on the trauma recovery centers in Los Angeles County. I believe you all received an executive summary of those results. So essentially, this was a 2-year study. It was based at 5 TRCs in LA County. It looked at over 1,600 individuals who were victims of crime that had some type of clinical involvement with these TRCs over that 2-year period. We did 35 interviews with staff that worked with TRCs and another 25 interviews with victims of crime who received services from one of these TRCs. And we really had, I would say, kind of 5 main findings. The first one is that it does seem like the TRCs are reaching the target population that they intended to serve. So you'll see when you look at the summary, 68% of individuals who are receiving the services identify as Hispanic, 13% identify as Black, 80% are on Medi-Cal or uninsured, about 1 in 5 are unstably housed, about 60% of individuals have a high school education or less. Secondly, the process metrics that we're seeing are pretty high. So on average per site, the TRCs are able to do about 100 mental health sessions per month and about 50 case management sessions per month. And this matters because the clients who are getting at least 8 mental health sessions, we're seeing pretty dramatic improvements in terms of their overall symptoms. So there's an average reduction of about 15 points in their PTSD symptoms. And in terms of what that means, they're basically going from a diagnosis of PTSD at the beginning to potentially no longer having a clinical diagnosis of PTSD at the end. We're also seeing increases in the quality of life. And then we're also seeing improvements in terms of social needs, really across the board. So improvement in terms of acute medical needs, transportation, employment, legal needs. Again, pretty wide breadth of what is being addressed. The last point I'll bring up, I really think has already been touched on by the other 2 panelists. The interviews, the qualitative interviews that we did were quite helpful in giving a little more context to the care delivery system. And a lot of what we're hearing from both clinicians as well as victims of crime themselves is that these are just really complex cases. Often there's a lot of prior trauma that has happened. We know that if you're at risk for, if you have been a victim of violent crime, you're at risk for future crime. And often that means a lot of complex mental health issues, but also a lot of compounding of social needs ultimately. And so in general, what we're hearing from staff and then also from victims of crime is just frustrations with sometimes the restriction of the model in terms of how it's funding and just the sustainability of being able to plan and invest in terms of this being a model for care that is continuously provided. And so what I have kind of heard from clinicians over time, not just from moving from a kind of contract to grant-based system, but I'm also hearing a request to be part of a continuous care delivery, so that this is not something that they're having to reapply for funding every 1.5 years, essentially. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if you were here at the beginning of the panels this morning. Listen, we think that this work is extraordinarily important, and we wouldn't have included you if we didn't. We also hear loud and clear, as with so many of programs in this space, but in others, that funding is job one. Unfortunately, that's not our jurisdiction or expertise. So it's hard. So I don't want to go down that path, although I hear you loud and clear. And I hope that we might be able to, by endorsing some of the work that you do, indirectly support some efforts at funding. But I don't think this committee can help you directly with resolving some of the funding issues and contracting issues that have come up. With that said, I often ask people, if their magic wand, if they could, in terms of improving the policies of the work that they're doing. I was wondering if each of you could come up with, just if you have a specific policy recommendation to make these programs more effective, more scalable, more efficient, help more people. Sorry, Ms. Gledhill.
Thanks. So the core of the TRC model is the comprehensive approach, and I really appreciate that. I will say that I think that we have found in our years of administering the programs that the staffing requirements really become restrictive for certain areas of the state. So having to have on staff a licensed psychologist, psychiatrist, and licensed clinical social worker is just not possible, especially when you're not connected to a major hospital. So when we have areas of the Central Valley where the hospitals are closing, or far northern California, where there really isn't a large comprehensive hospital, it makes it very challenging. That was one of the reasons that the legislature endorsed satellite offices, where they would be offshoots of major branches and they would not have to hold on their own that level of staffing. And so that is something that I'm not trying to diminish the need of those professionals to be part of the process, because I recognize that that's important. It's a question of, do they have to be full-time on staff, or can there be more flexibility in their ability to telehealth, or come certain days of the week, or whatever that is. And I'm not an expert in the model and how it should be implemented, but I do know that we have found through over the years of administering the program, that has been the biggest barrier to establishing TRCs in more areas of the state. Not saying that the TRCs where there aren't important and necessary, but we know that there are pockets where we're just not able to continue to have TRCs that have been established and keep operating or establish at all because of the staffing requirements.
That makes sense. I understand that. And we run into similar issues. It's such a big state with so many, diverse populations, diverse needs, and I appreciate that. Dr. Rodriguez Castro.
Hi. Yeah, happy to answer that first. Those levels of staff do not have to be full-time in person. We have lots of the TRCs that do virtual work with them. We have TRCs that have contracts for limited amounts of time with a psychiatrist or a psychologist. We do need the treatment to be done by licensed clinicians. That's part of the way we get those very significant outcomes. There's lots of great peer models or community-based models, but to get the efficacy that we have to follow the model with the treatment end of it. And then for my own recommendation, we're working on the federal level to try to get TRCs included in federal funding, like the Burn JAG grants, and move it to opportunities around violence prevention and violence intervention. And if we could do that in California, we would open up other pots of money that could diversify the funding for TRCs and not put them in the position of constantly being at jeopardy of closing every 2 years and applying every year and a half if they had some diversified funding opportunities. So I think that would be my number one recommendation.
Thank you. Dr. Decker and then Professor Rummel.
Yeah, so I think what I mentioned before, trying to think about how to move from this contract to grant-based funding to really continuous care delivery models. And, I recognize the audience that I'm speaking with today, but, I would almost kind of go as far to say whether we should thinking about having this more within the healthcare system. So CalAIM has been an expansion of Medicaid over the last couple years in the state, and there's special populations that receive priority through CalAIM. One of that is individuals who are involved with the criminal justice system, but right now there's no arm of that that's related to individuals who are victims of crime. As I kind of keep hearing from all the staff through all these interviews, it does seem like having this potentially live in a more kind of continuous care-based delivery system that has a little potentially more experience with some of these quite complex mental health issues, as well as the case management that goes with that, might be one way to tackle this. Obviously, there's quite a few different ways that we could approach this. Thank you.
Professor Rummel.
Thanks, and for your excellent work and for presenting to us today. Following up on Dr. Castro Rodriguez's point and an earlier point that was made that you don't qualify for violence prevention dollars, and having spent the whole morning discussing violence prevention and the importance of trauma-based treatments and interventions and mentorships and the work that some community-based organizations are doing in that space. Maybe this is a very broad idea, but maybe it's time for California to recognize the intersection between people who experience violence and perpetrate violence. And I'm not saying that we're going to, run into your centers and start bringing in people who perpetrated violence or who are at risk of perpetrating violence. But if we could think about the overlap in those two and maybe redefine victim in some way, that because everyone I think on the Zoom knows it, people who experience violence and trauma perpetrate, but not everyone, but many people, that is the basis of their acting out in violence. And that we had maybe a more holistic approach, and, you know, on a micro scale, maybe you qualify for more violence prevention dollars, because certainly the work you're doing is violence prevention in a real way. I don't know I'm just curious about thoughts about that. That's kind of just a big idea I'm throwing out there, but I'm curious about how you think that would look on the ground with the trauma work that you're already involved in and doing so well.
Dr. Castro Rodriguez.
That would absolutely be helpful. And we absolutely do serve survivors who also have been defendants or convicted of crimes. It's a cycle. Violence is a cycle. We all know that, but it's very difficult for us to make those cases when we apply for funding. We're often seen as a mental health treatment model, but if you look at the demographics of who we serve, you know, we're showing up at emergency room and bedside and working with people that have been victims of gun violence. And often they may be pending a charge or they may be charged in those cases. We still see them as victims, and we're still trying to prevent future violence for them, as well as future harm that they can cause, right? So we are absolutely working in that space, but we're not recognized in that space, and expanding the definition of victims would be really helpful for us. And it really helps us reach the most marginalized people, the people who don't come forward because they may be involved in criminal activity or may have a history of criminal activity. And that bars them from accessing California victims compensation in many cases, not all. And so they're not getting any sort of support for being a crime victim, even if that is not related to the crime they were accused of. Thank you.
Dr. Tyria, tell me how you pronounce your name. I'm sorry.
Tyra, it's Tyra.
Tyra.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Thank you. So I just wanted to make a comment related to what Professor Rummel had said. You know, here in the LA County Department of Health Services, we have two trauma recovery centers and 3 hospital-based violence intervention programs, and so which we call HVIPs. So we really view TRCs and HVIPs as being complementary and work together. And so that's our approach to really viewing, you know, breaking the cycle of violence as a community, like at the community level and at the county level here, as having to work together. And so, so we have started kind of viewing things in that way, you know, related to our health system. However, I would say that, you know, one of the barriers to thinking in that way, you know, on a larger scale is this funding, the funding sources, right? That funding sources are often for either, you know, either for justice involved individuals or for victims, and they don't view it in this holistic way. But if we can somehow influence people to think more in that way, it would be helpful. I agree.
Thank you. Other committee members have questions? Staff? Okay. Thank you all. As with all of our panelists, we've learned we learn a ton every time, and you know that you introduce us to a whole new world, and I appreciate that there are like extraordinary complications and nuances that we're intentionally ignoring, right? You know, part of it is because it is, I think, beyond our legal purview to get into some things. Part of it is because, like, thank goodness we don't have we can't get into the weeds, so we're wishing certain problems away. But for the most part, it really does seem like the work that you guys are doing is excellent, and that we as a system need to try to find a better way of integrating. I mean, and we've talked about this in other contexts, victim services and victims' rights into the criminal legal system in a way that recognizes kind of the holistic approach that victims and perpetrators often are sometimes the same people, same communities, same families, revolving cycles of violence and harm. Even when that's not the case, that we are often not doing the best that we can by crime victims or communities in the way that our system is drawn up, and that's something that we certainly want to prioritize. So thank you for what you do, for being here, for challenging us honestly to think a little bit harder about how to integrate this into the penal code. I think that that's going to be sort of our committee's challenge, is to figure, candidly to figure that out. If you guys, like I said, if you guys have any excellent ideas, please remain in touch, and we will do the same. And thank you all. The next piece of our agenda, moving on, I think we're going to take a lunch break. Does reconvening at 1 p.m. make sense for everybody? All right, let's reconvene for lunch. Let's take a lunch break, reconvene at 1 p.m. After lunch, we have a presentation, one more panel. We'll discuss what we've been talking about this morning, and finish up with a couple of administrative matters and public comment. Thanks.
And Mike, I'll be delayed. I can't come back on right at 1, but I will come back on.
No problem. Good to see you.